Hey everyone, welcome to Climb with Jimmy. Today I'm excited to share with you my customizable mountaineering training spreadsheet. I created this spreadsheet because I'm using Steve House and Scott Johnston's book, Training for the New Alpinism, to get ready for a non-technical summit of Mount Kenya in a few months. I'm going to be trekking to Point Lenana, which is the third highest peak of Mount Kenya at 16,355 feet. I really like this book. If you haven't read it, it's packed with incredible information about how to train effectively for mountaineering objectives, as well as illuminating case studies, essays, inspiring photos, and insights from hard-won experience. If you're not familiar with the authors, Steve House is considered to be one of the best mountaineers in the world. But after a near-fatal accident in 2010, he retired from hard climbing and now dedicates his time to sharing his climbing knowledge with others. Scott Johnston coached Steve House, as well as a number of other elite athletes, and together they wrote this book, Training for the New Alpinism. Their book offers the most comprehensive discussion of the physiology and training strategy for serious mountaineering that I'm aware of. If you check out the reviews on Amazon, it will give you some sense of how the book has been received. The problem I ran into, however, is that while Training for the New Alpinism lays out principles for effective training, it doesn't provide a detailed training plan, which is up to the reader to create. I've noticed that others have run into this same problem. It turns out that solving this problem is a little more difficult than it might seem. So I created a spreadsheet based on the principles outlined in the book that automates the process for you. What makes this training spreadsheet different from other training plans available is that you can adjust it to your specific needs and the entire plan will update accordingly. So, for example, if last year you wanted to start out your first week of training at 120 minutes of volume per week, but this year you wanted to start at 180 minutes of volume per week, that's no problem. All you have to do is change the starting training volume and your entire plan will update accordingly. Or let's say you want to adjust the number of weeks in your training plan, or to emphasize different types of training more or less at different times. All of this will update automatically depending on the parameters you set. Finally, say you want to be able to visualize your training plan or your actual completed training over time. If you use the spreadsheet to enter your actual training each day, it will show you how much you've done and how that compares to what you planned to do in a single graph. Stick around for a demo of how the spreadsheet works, or click on the link in the description below if you'd like to get your own copy. So in order to understand how this spreadsheet actually works, first, we need to take a closer look at some of the most important training principles in House and Johnston's book. Before we get started, I should note that I'm not affiliated with Steve House or Scott Johnston, and that I'm not a medical professional. This is just my attempt to apply the principles from their book. You should consult your physician before undertaking any of the activities discussed here and before attempting a mountaineering objective. If you do decide to move forward with training, I would also recommend purchasing a copy of House and Johnston's book. It's worth every dollar. So let's dive in. There are actually 4 different phases of training discussed in this book. Before training begins, House and Johnston recommend a fitness assessment, which of course helps you determine your current level of fitness. I won't get into the fitness assessment in detail in this video, but it's worth checking out the discussion of this topic in the book. The first real phase of training is the 8-week transition period, where you get ready to start training more seriously. During the transition period, core exercises are introduced as well as general strength training. I like that the first section of the chapter dedicated to the transition period is entitled, Listen to Your Body. The authors explain, part of the purpose of the transition period is to feel how you react to training. I think that the transition period is primarily about figuring out how to ease into training in a way that is right for you. But the idea of listening to your body applies to each phase of training, and I'll come back to this idea later in the video. Training isn't so much about following a predetermined schedule. It's about making a plan and then making smart decisions each day about what makes sense for you, given how you feel. Another key principle used throughout the book is also reiterated in this section. The authors write, continuity gradualness, modulation. Those are our watchwords. Continuity is listed first for a reason. Without continuity, the other two will become moot. The authors return to these ideas throughout the book, and I think they provide a really solid framework for thinking about training in general. Continuity means continuing to show up regularly. Gradualness means making small adjustments in one's training regimen, rather than trying to make huge leaps that you aren't ready for. And modulation means adjusting between periods of consolidating gains through rest and increasing total volume in order to raise one's fitness to the next level. These principles apply for all of the training periods. The second phase of training is the base period, which is the period my spreadsheet is specifically designed to help you navigate. The base period lasts at least 12 weeks, but can be extended as long as 28 weeks. The authors write of the base period: the training that will help you feel the strongest and most energized when you set off from high camp is a solid, structured base period. We've continually emphasized the necessity of building a solid endurance foundation before adding a high volume of specific training. Recall that the purpose of this base period is to toughen you up, to improve your fatigue resistance so that you can handle more hard climbing and hard climbing specific training in the future. For most climbers, this means many hours of basic conditioning as a supplement to regular climbing. The base period is actually broken into two subphases. The first subphase of the base period is the max strength period. This subphase can last up to 8 weeks. The purpose of building strength in the context of mountaineering, which is in many ways an endurance activity, is that strength training increases the number of muscle fibers available for subsequent endurance activities. Perhaps counterintuitively, House and Johnston argue strength is essential for endurance. They explain it like this: training for maximum strength has a large neurologic effect by improving the brain's ability to recruit more fibers. Once these new motor units become more readily accessible via the improved neurological connections, they can be recruited on a rotating basis as needed for lower force contractions like climbing or hiking uphill. As individual fibers and even entire motor units become fatigued, they are rested when new fibers are brought into the act. With a large pool of fibers available, there are more fibers to share in the workload on this rotating basis. Thus, higher power outputs can be sustained for longer times, and improved endurance is the result. As we hope you can see by now, strength is the basis of endurance. In other words, what House and Johnston are saying is that endurance activities actually involve rotating between different groups of muscle fiber, using some fibers while allowing others to rest. If one increases the total number of available fibers through strength training, this increases the number of fibers available to rotate during endurance activities as well. If you are short on time, the maximum strength period can be skipped, since strength training is part of the general base period training anyway. However, as the authors note, it can make sense to dedicate a certain amount of time to focus on increasing strength, since this expands the upper range of your endurance. The second subphase of the base period converts maximum strength into muscular endurance. House and Johnston write, the goal of this phase is to improve the percentage of your maximum muscle power you can sustain for a longer and longer time. In other words, if the maximum strength period increases how many muscle fibers are available, the muscular endurance period of the base training period increases how hard and how long you can use those new muscle fibers in an endurance activity like mountaineering. The key idea of the base period is to complete a certain volume of training each week. House and Johnston recommend increasing one's total volume of training by a certain percentage and allocating that total training volume between different types of activities, including Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, and strength training. For technical alpine objectives, they add alpine climbing and cragging as well. This is where a spreadsheet comes in handy because it takes a lot of time to calculate how many minutes per week should be allocated to each training type. Before I get to that, let me mention the last two phases of training. The third phase of training is called specific training. House and Johnston explain that all the training up to this point is basically training to get ready for training. However, they also explain that the training in this third phase is for most athletes the least important. It is far more important, they say, to complete a full period of base training than to rush into climbing-specific training. They write, for less well-conditioned climbers, a base period of 16 to 20 weeks or more will be helpful. Remember the bank account analogy described in an earlier part of this book. You need to have as big of a bank balance as possible before you enter this period. The more hard work you are capable of doing, the better the results from this climbing-focused training will be. Unless you have put in an absolute minimum of 12 weeks of good base training, skip this specific period and keep building your base right up until your trip. Despite its direct application to climbing, this is actually the least critical stage of the training, and the one most dependent on the work before it being done correctly. The specific training period lasts about 4 weeks and involves activities that are directly related to what you will be doing on your mountaineering trip. The final period of training is called tapering. House and Johnston explain, the purpose of the taper period is to allow your body to fully recover and realize a maximum state of supercompensation from the long-term stress of training. Tapering is a period of rest right before one attempts a difficult objective. Rest allows all the gains from the previous weeks and months of training to consolidate. The taper period lasts from 4 days to 14 days. So those are the 4 periods of training: transition, base, specific, and taper. Before we take a look at the spreadsheet I made to calculate what you need to do during each week of your base period, let's discuss the different types of training that make up the base period in a little more detail. The first thing to understand is that House and Johnston divide muscular endurance, or base training, into types based on heart rate. There are 5 different zones, which are distinguished based on a heart rate range that is specific to each zone. Zone 1 activities can be done while holding a conversation with another person. They require approximately 55 to 75% of your maximum heart rate. It's common to calculate your maximum heart rate by subtracting your age from 220. I'm 38, so my maximum heart rate is probably around 182. However, House and Johnston point out that this approach is based on averages and is not as precise as a maximum heart rate test. For me, however, subtracting my age from 220 is good enough to give me an approximate idea of my maximum heart rate. If my maximum heart rate is 182, 55 to 75% of that maximum is 100 to 137 beats per minute. This is my zone 1 range. If you're worried about figuring out your heart rate for each zone, don't worry. I'll help you with that in the automated training planner that we're going to look at in a moment. So what does a zone 1 activity look like? I found that it's actually pretty hard to keep my heart rate in the zone 1 range. If I'm just walking, my heart rate tends to stay a little too low. But if I run, it tends to go too high. My compromise has been to start out running and to use my Garmin watch to keep an eye on my heart rate. When I get up to about 135, I walk until my heart rate drops down to about 100. Then I start running again. I found that after I do this a few times, my heart rate starts to stay within a zone 1 range for longer stretches, and that I don't have to keep running after this very often. Adding a weighted vest can also help to keep the heart rate in the zone 1 range without running. Cycling is another activity which I have found works for me as a zone 1 exercise. You'll have to experiment and see what works for you. I also like to add a little specific training into my zone 1 exercises by finding terrain that is similar to the terrain I'll encounter on a trip. This is a little hard in Chicago, where I live, but I found that if I go along the shore of Lake Michigan, there are a few spots that work pretty well. Zone 2 activities involve a slightly higher heart rate, 75 to 80% of your maximum. You should still be able to breathe through your nose while performing these activities. My Zone 2 range is 137 to 146 beats per minute. For Zone 2, I find that it's easier to stay in the right range while running than it is for Zone 1 training, but I still find that I need to walk occasionally to make sure that my heart rate doesn't go too high. You might also experiment with Zone 2 endurance climbing at the gym, for example, by climbing routes a few grades below your skill level continuously and keeping an eye on your heart rate to make sure it stays in the appropriate range. Zone 3 activities are sometimes called fun hard. They range from 80 to 90% of your maximum heart rate, which for me is 146 to 164 beats per minute. For Zone 3, you might try hill running, stair climbs, or box jumps. House and Johnston also recommend using a treadmill with your feet on the floor and your hands on the treadmill for upper body endurance. I haven't tried this yet, but it seems like an effective way to train your upper body for Zone 3 endurance. Zones 4 and 5 don't really come into base period training, but I'll mention them here for completeness. Zone 4 is 90 to 95% of your maximum heart rate, which for me is 164 to 173 beats per minute. Zone 5 is 95 to 100% of your maximum heart rate. And for me, that's 173 to 182 beats per minute. Zone 4 and 5 exercises include things like high-intensity interval training, sprinting, hill workouts, or power cycling. In addition to Zone 1, 2, and 3 endurance training, the base period also includes strength training. If you're doing a technical alpine objective, House and Johnston add alpine climbing and cragging as well to the types of training we've already discussed. It obviously helps to practice climbing at the gym or in some other way that approximates the type of endurance you'll need for your final objective. I don't think we need to discuss these types of training in detail in this video, but I do recommend checking out the strength exercises provided in the book. So how much of each type of exercise do you need to do each week? That depends on a few factors. First, it depends on what volume of training you think is right for you to get started. My instinct is that anything less than about 2 hours per week is probably too little. I decided to start at 5 hours per week for my current base period because I've been doing strength training, endurance, and a decent amount of gym climbing regularly for the last several months. You'll need to listen to your own body, however, to figure out what is best for you. The second thing you need to figure out is how much you will increase your total amount of training volume each week. House and Johnston recommend increasing gradually, but cutting back every 4 weeks to rest and recover. They emphasize that adequate rest is an essential part of training. They write, "Training makes you weaker, not stronger. It is during the recovery that you become stronger." The third factor is the percent of your total volume for each week that you want to allocate to the different types of training. House and Johnston provide some guidelines for this. Here are the guidelines for weeks 1 through 8, 9 through 16, and 17 through 20 of the base period. One thing to note about the percentages that House and Johnston recommend is that Zone 1 exercises actually make up the majority of one's training volume all the way through the base period. It might be helpful to explain in detail why this allocation makes sense. The authors note that the aerobic base actually involves 2 components. The first component is VO2 max, or aerobic power. This is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use during intense exercise. VO2 max is determined by observing the point at which oxygen consumption in the body remains flat, even if one increases exercise intensity. So, for example, if I'm running very hard and keep running hard as long as I can, there will come a point where my body is not capable of utilizing any more oxygen per minute, even if I run harder or longer. That's my VO2 max. It represents the upper limit of my body's ability to deliver oxygen to muscles and convert it into energy for sustained performance. The other component of the aerobic base is called aerobic capacity, or fractional utilization of VO2 max. If VO2 max is your ceiling on aerobic power, aerobic capacity is how close you're able to stay near that ceiling over an extended period of time. In other words, I might have a relatively high VO2 max that I can utilize in short bursts, but I might not be able to utilize very much of that overall power for an extended period. House and Johnston point out that while VO2 max is somewhat trainable, it's much easier and more impactful to train aerobic capacity, or fractional utilization of VO2 max. The physiology here is a little complex, but the basic idea is that the key to developing aerobic capacity lies in low-intensity, high-volume training, Zone 1 and 2 workouts. That's because this training specifically targets slow-twitch muscle fibers, which are highly fatigue-resistant and primarily rely on fat for fuel rather than glycogen, that is, stored carbohydrates. fat burns more slowly and provides longer-lasting energy than glycogen, which means you can perform using this source of fuel for longer periods. The more you train slow-twitch muscle fibers, the more activity those fibers will be capable of for longer periods of time. On the other hand, if you train at higher intensity, zone 3 and above, you'll be training your fast-twitch muscle fibers. These fibers are more powerful, but they rely on glycogen as their primary fuel source. This type of training will increase your power and speed, but it won't enhance the body's ability to sustain long-duration activity using fat as a primary energy source. Once your body runs out of glycogen, which happens fairly quickly, this training will no longer serve you. It won't increase your ability to cycle through the different groups of muscle fiber that you built through your strength training, using them over long periods of time while relying on slow-burning fat stores for energy. As an aside, I think this principle can be applied to other types of climbing as well, not just mountaineering. For example, say you wanted to increase your bouldering grade. You might benefit from doing a high volume of training at lower levels in order to build a strong base of endurance that would subsequently allow you to train for more difficult routes without getting tired as quickly. If this explanation of aerobic endurance is a little confusing, don't worry. The main thing you need to know is that if you want to increase your ability to perform at a high level for a long period of time, the best thing you can do is to train using high volume but low intensity exercise for at least 12 weeks leading up to your mountaineering objective or other planned event. If you want to learn more about how to train effectively in different zones, I would recommend checking out Dr. Peter Attia's or Dr. Andy Galpin's videos on this topic, which I'll link below. Even if you get the basic idea here, if you're like me, it's a little overwhelming trying to get a clear sense of what all of this means practically. I started out trying to write out a training plan for myself, but I realized it was going to take a very long time to do all the calculations with my iPhone calculator. I also realized that if I changed anything, I would have to redo all the calculations from the beginning. I decided I needed to make a spreadsheet, so that's what I did. I think we're ready now to take a look. I already mentioned that what makes this planner different from other training plans is that you can adjust it to your specific needs and the entire plan will update accordingly. We're ready now to take a closer look at how it works. The first sheet of the training planner has 4 inputs. The first input is your current volume of exercise per week in minutes. This is basically how much training you ended up doing during your transition period, or how much you think you feel comfortable doing currently. You can enter however many minutes you wish, but 2 hours per week seems to me like a reasonable minimum. After this, enter the date when you'll start training. This can be any date. The date you enter here will determine the first day of your training on the weekly log sheet. Next, enter the total number of weeks you plan to train, and that can be anything from 1 through 40. Finally, enter your age. This is used to calculate your approximate maximum heart rate on the next sheet. Now, let's take a look at the heart rate zones sheet. This sheet takes your age and subtracts it from 220 to calculate your approximate maximum heart rate. Since I'm 38, my maximum heart rate is expected to be around 182. The spreadsheet takes that number and multiplies it by the percentages for each heart rate zone in columns C and D, so I know exactly what the appropriate range is for that zone in columns E and F. You can also do a maximum heart rate test to get a more precise maximum heart rate. If you choose to do so, enter that number in the yellow box, and the spreadsheet will use that number instead of the one calculated by subtracting your age from 220. So let's say that I know my maximum heart rate is actually 185. The ranges here will update accordingly based on the number I enter. The next sheet calculates your actual training plan for each week. At the top, you have the option to decide whether you want to use recommended training allocations from House and Johnston's book, or whether you would like to use your own. In the first yellow box, you can select either Mountaineering, Technical Alpine, or Custom. If you select Custom, you can enter your own percentages in the table below and to the right, which we'll come back to. You can see that the chart to the right of these yellow boxes updates automatically depending on which option you've chosen. So if I click on Mountaineering, it will change to the allocations recommended for Mountaineering. or back to technical alpine. I'm actually going to leave this on mountaineering for now. The big advantage of this spreadsheet is that because it's totally automated, it saves you from having to do all the calculations for your chosen training plan. It's also repeatable. So if you need to change your plan from one year to the next, you can just create a new copy of the spreadsheet and adjust your plan accordingly for that year's adventure. After you select your training type, you'll also want to select whether you want to increase your total training volume each week by the amounts recommended by House and Johnston or by your own custom amounts. If I select custom, you'll see that the total training volume stays flat since I haven't entered anything in the custom values table. We'll take a quick look at that table. It's just down here to the right. And let's say I want to increase total training volume by 5% each week. We can now come back to the chart, and you'll see that the total volume per week now increases accordingly. Let's put this back to the recommended percentages. If you move down to the tables below the instructions and the chart, you can see the engine of the training plan. The table starts out with your current volume of training per week, and that's right here. I entered 300 minutes back in the inputs, my current weekly exercise. So that carries over here, and this is our baseline. The sheet is set up to use House and Johnston's recommended incremental increase in training volume per week. So if you look in column E, you can see that training goes up by 10% for the first 3 weeks, then drops by 25% in week 4, which is a recovery week. This pattern of gradual increases followed by recovery weeks continues over the course of 20 weeks. And here I only have this filled out for 12 weeks because that's what I selected at the beginning. But if we come back, we can increase our number of training weeks to 20 just to see the full number of percentages. And now that's filled in. House and Johnston's recommended plan, I think, can be stopped at 4-week intervals, actually, at any point. So you could train for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, or 20 weeks, depending on how much time you have, using the recommended percentages from the book. So if you look at column F, this shows the cumulative increase in training volume since you started. So for example, by week 9, you're doing 73% more weekly training volume than you were during your transition period. And by week 20, you're doing 139% more total training volume. If you go to columns C and D, these show the total training volume for each week in minutes and hours. So that's your basic training volume and how it's determined for each week. Now, if we move over here to this light blue section, in columns G through L, this shows how much of the total training volume per week gets allocated to each type of training. So you can see there's a column for zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and strength, as well as for alpine climbing and cragging. The sheet automatically uses the percentages recommended by House and Johnston. But as I already mentioned, it allows you to switch between mountaineering and technical alpine or a custom plan. So we'll zoom out and we'll go back to this first yellow box, and you can see that these percentages here change depending on what we select. The light green and orange sections of this sheet just show you how many minutes or how many hours per week you'll be dedicating to each type of training based on your starting weekly training volume and the training plan you've selected. So here is your minutes per week for zone 1, zone 2, and so on. And here are your hours per week of zone 1, zone 2, and so on. Now, if you want to extend your training beyond 20 weeks, which is more than the recommended percentages included in Scott House and Steve Johnston's book, you can do this by entering new values in the white cells in column AA. So I already entered this 5% before. We don't need this right now because we're not using the custom percentages. But here you can see nothing's going on here after week 20. So if we wanted to enter more training, let's just say we want to increase by 1% each week after week 20. And let's say we also want to allocate to zone 1, 60%. You can see this first column is zone 1. I'll explain that in a moment. And we'll do 20% here for zone 2 and 20% for zone 3. Now, our chart is filled in over here. We know how many minutes or how many hours we're going to be allocating to these zone 1, 2, and 3 types of training. And if you come back up to your chart, you can see that it now extends out over the course of 40 weeks. I already mentioned that you can also remove weeks if you want to do training for less time. So right now we're at 20 weeks, but if I go back to the beginning, I can set this to 12 weeks, which is actually what I'm doing for my Mount Kenya trip. So now it just shows 12 weeks of training and stops there. So let's say you don't actually want to use one of the training programs recommended by House and Johnston, or that you just want to modify one of their programs a little bit. You actually have the option to set your own percentages all the way through. And you can do this by going back to the 2 yellow boxes at the beginning and selecting custom in each box. So when I do this for the type of training objective, all of the data on the graph disappears because we haven't entered anything there yet. And I will also set this to custom percent. Now we need to go back to columns AA through AG, this table right here, and enter our own percentages. So let's say we just want to increase training by 5% each week for 20 weeks. We do that right here. And let's say we want to allocate, kind of like we were saying before, 60% to zone 1, 20% to zone 2, and 20% to zone 3. So now if we go up to our chart, we can see that the training allocations and the weekly increases that we entered are reflected here. But let's say that we actually want to do a different type of training. Say that you're training for a triathlon and you want this to be running, cycling, and swimming. We can actually enter those numbers here: running, cycling, swimming. And we don't need these 3 columns, so we're going to enter an X in those. And you'll see that running, cycling, and swimming now carry throughout our chart. And those are reflected up here. So running is blue, cycling is orange, and swimming is dark green. So the training plan is flexible in this way. You can use it not only for mountaineering, but for any other type of training you might want to do. Okay, I'm going to set this back to where it was. So we're going to go to mountaineering and recommended percentages. This is the training that I'm actually doing for my Mount Kenya trip. So we can now move over to the weekly log sheet, which is where you'll enter how many minutes of exercises you completed during each week of your training plan. You can see I've already entered some numbers for the first few weeks. This section should be pretty self-explanatory. I would note, however, that it doesn't really matter when you do the different training types each week. You can break up your total volume of each training type however you want. I think it makes sense to do more difficult training on days when you feel you have the energy for it, and to do easier zone 1 training when you might not be up for a strength workout or zone 2 running. And this goes back to the idea of listening to your body from the earlier section of this video. But I don't think it matters much if you choose to do all of your zone 1 training in one big chunk or break it up into smaller sessions over several days. The main thing is that over the course of the week, you complete the total volume of training planned for the week. For strength training, it was a little unclear to me at first how to log the total training time, since strength training typically involves breaks between sets. For myself, I decided to start the clock at the beginning of my first set and to end the clock after completing my last set. So I include the breaks as part of my time dedicated to strength training, but there may be other ways to answer this question. Finally, let's look at the training summary sheet. This sheet summarizes how much of each exercise you completed each week. We'll zoom in here. You have the option to view your completed exercise as a total number of actual minutes completed, which is this, actual minutes. If you look down here, it shows how many minutes I did for each exercise in the second column compared to how many I planned. And you can see I did some extra climbing at the gym. Oh, it still says cycling, swimming, cycling, and running. So let's go back and change that. So we'll get rid of this. So I planned 182 minutes of zone 1 and I completed 180 in that first week. And you can go from there. It also includes this gym climbing I did, which I entered under cragging, which wasn't part of my plan, but it still shows up. And I basically counted that toward the strength, the light blue strength training, which I did not complete. We can also look at this as a percentage of planned training. So now I plan to do 55% of my training toward zone 1, and I completed up to 54% of the total planned time. 20% of zone 2, I was on target, and I was only at 16% of the planned volume for strength training, but I had this extra climbing time, so I did actually 124% of the total time I had planned to do. So that's it for the spreadsheet. You can find a copy of the spreadsheet at the link posted in the description. Please post any questions you might have in the comments, and please let me know if the spreadsheet turned out to be useful for you in preparing for your next adventure. I'd love to hear what you're training for. I'll leave you with this quotation from Yvon Chouinard, founder of Patagonia. There are a dozen reasons for climbing, some bad, and I've used most of them myself. The worst are fame and money. Commonly, people cite exploration or discovery, but that's rarely relevant in today's world. The only good reason to climb is to improve yourself.